Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. When we think of history, there's a lot of different ideas that come to mind. If you're a student, you think of a big giant history textbook that you have to lug around every day and eventually read chapters and different stories. For a college student, you see more specialized books, things which will go ahead and allow you to look at different aspects of things that go on in history. That way you get a better expertise as to what's going on. And for those who are more academic, you want to focus in on certain aspects that will only suit your interests and your interests alone. But the one thing everybody who ever looks at history can sometimes often enjoy are the little hidden treasures, the hidden history, so to speak, that could be found within history. And so joining us today is the author of the new book, The Hidden History of Northern Virginia, Mr. Charles A. Mills, who is sometimes co-host and of the show. And so we're excited to talk about your book today and learn a little bit more about this area of Virginia that might not otherwise be known.
Great. Well, I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk to the folks about it because I love history. And the reason I love history is when you strip out all the dates and all the interpretations, what you really have is the story of people interacting day to day. And whenever you get people, hundreds of people, thousands of people, millions of people over the centuries interacting, you're going to get some pretty strange stories. And that's what I've tried to capture here in Hidden History of Northern Virginia, some of the stories you don't normally hear about in the history courses.
Well, that's true, and there are a number of strange tales. And so one of the first ones that kind of sparks the interest is dealing with the Spanish here in Northern Virginia.
Yes. Now, we're all familiar with the English establishing Jamestown in 1607, but how many of us really know that the Spanish were here first? As a matter of fact, you had a number of European explorers in the Chesapeake Bay, and at the time, these European explorers thought that the Chesapeake was a hidden passage to China. And so obviously people wanted to get astride of that and control it. So in 1570, 7 Jesuit priests approached the governor of Florida, Pedro Menendez, and said, "Governor, we'll go up to that area and we will convert thousands of natives. And Spain will then have a buffer state right there astride the passage to China." Well, you know, you might think this was a pretty bold claim. 7 unarmed men are going to go up and convert thousands of savages. Well, they had an ace up their sleeve. And that ace was the fact that when one of the earlier European exploration ships had been in the area, it came away with a son of one of the Indian Native American chiefs. And this boy was trained in Mexico and in Spain. And he learned Spanish and he learned European ways and he converted to Christianity. And he changed his name to Don Luis. So Don Luis and the 7 Jesuit priests arrive in the Virginia, what we know as Virginia today, and start converting the natives. Well, it wasn't long before Don Luis went back to his people, dropped his Spanish name, took off his Spanish clothes, and renounced Christianity. And if that's all he'd done, that would have been a good thing for the Jesuits, because shortly thereafter, he returned with a bunch of warriors and massacred all of the Jesuits. And there was only one survivor of this massacre, and this was a young altar boy who was subsequently rescued by a Spanish ship. He returned to Florida. He told the governor what had happened. Governor Menendez sent a punitive expedition. They arrived. They hung a few natives as a token of Spanish justice, whether the natives actually had anything to do with the murders or not, and they sailed away. 37 years later, the English arrived. Jamestown is founded, and the rest is history as we know it.
It's amazing to think because the Spanish exploration is certainly very big and brought about many different ways of knowing what was here. But, you know, but while most people might not realize about the Spanish, how about more well-known people that we are more familiar with?
Okay, well, let's jump couple of centuries forward to one of the best-known Americans, George Washington. Well, historians have always had trouble with the topic of George Washington and slavery. When he died in 1799, there were over 300 slaves working at Mount Vernon. Now, some people say George Washington was a stern master, as you might expect of a military man. And others say, oh, no, he was very kind and generous and far more liberal than his neighbors. Well, we may never know exactly what George Washington thought about slavery, but we do know what at least two of George Washington's slaves thought about being owned by George Washington. They ran away and they never came back. Now, one of these slaves was called Henry Washington, and his real name is unknown. And he was born in 1740 along the Gambia River in Africa. And as a young man in his 20s, he was sold into slavery, and he subsequently became the property of George Washington. And he became a groom at the stables at Mount Vernon. Well, as we all know, in 1775, the American colonies revolted against Great Britain. And you had the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, and there were a number of smaller battles here in Virginia. Well, in November 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation, and he said, any slave who runs away from his master and joins the British Army will become free. So hundreds of slaves began to leave their plantations and head for the British lines. And one of these was Henry Washington. He made his way to Norfolk, and he joined Lord Dunmore's forces in an outfit called the Ethiopian Regiment. And this was a unit made up entirely of blacks, 400 fighting men. And they fought under the banner, Freedom for Slaves. And this was extremely provocative for Virginia's slave owners. Well, after a couple of battles, one which he won, one which he lost, Lord Dunmore was thrown out of Virginia, and he went to New York with all of his forces. And the Ethiopian Regiment was demobilized. But Henry Washington went on to join another all-black unit called the Black Pioneers. Well, as the war proceeded, the British commander-in-chief in North America, Sir Henry Clinton, broadened out Lord Dunmore's proclamation and said, any slave who comes into British lines will automatically be emancipated. And so now you didn't have hundreds of slaves fleeing their plantations. You had thousands and tens of thousands. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that over 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom in the British lines. This was 20% of the entire slave population of the colonies. Now, why, might you say, did the British do this? Well, they did it exactly for the same reason that Abraham Lincoln was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation 7 years later. They did it for military reasons. They wanted to cripple the plantation economy of the rebels, and they also wanted to divert manpower that the rebels would be using against British troops. They wanted them to be protecting their slave assets from running away.
Well, certainly that's one of the biggest concerns that had happened, and even Washington tried to go ahead and entice slaves to join the American cause. But there's another story of Washington having a slave running away on him, but not so much his slave as it was more Martha's slave. And are you familiar with that particular story?
I am, and her name was Uni Judge, and she was a personal maid of Martha Washington's. And when the Washingtons were in Philadelphia, when it was the capital, Martha said to one of her relatives who was being married, I am going to make you a present of my personal maid. Well, Uni Judge was having none of this. She didn't like this idea. So she hopped a ship to New Hampshire and fled to New Hampshire. Well, Washington didn't like this very much, and he tried to get various people in New Hampshire to send her back or to send her to Alexandria.
Well, not quite.
And they wrote a letter and said, we don't think you better do this because there's a lot of anti-slavery sentiment here and it's going to cause a lot of embarrassment to you. So Washington kind of backed off.
Well, that's not quite how I hear the story, because from what I've heard the story is that Washington actually could have cared less about her running away. In fact, he was kind of like, well, all right, so she ran away. It's not like we don't have any other slaves back at Mount Vernon we can't bring up. It was actually Martha who demanded her back rather than the general. And so, as Professor Peter Henriquez was very fond of saying, Washington understood that it was far better to have a happy wife than it was to have a mad wife. And so he decided, okay, I will make a token effort of trying to get her back. Didn't work out so well, especially since he said, well, I'd rather not go ahead and have my personal honor destroyed. But at the same time, he didn't have a problem because, and this is one of the facts that is always interesting, a little bit of hidden history for Pennsylvania. If a slave came to Pennsylvania and was there for 6 months, as soon as the 6th month terminated, they were free.
Well, you see, this is where you always have a problem with Washington, because you always have a group of people who are going to defend his reputation no matter what. And whether Martha instigated it or whether it was George's idea, George was doing the letter writing. And there was also a nephew of George's who subsequently went to New Hampshire and tried to persuade Uni to come back, and she refused. Under the law, she was a fugitive slave until her death. And it was only the fact that New Hampshire was so violently anti-slavery that kept her from being returned by the friends of Washington. Let's face it, powerful men have powerful friends who want to please them.
Well, that's true, but also you have to wonder a little bit about whether or not Washington would have actually cared, considering the fact that if you look at the number of runaways, most slave masters would have had more than that. And here's Washington with only two big ones. And of course, there was an incident of slaves leaving when the British came up the Potomac. But there was another incident in your book that caught my eye a little bit, and I was actually thinking about it. And that is this allegation that the general might have sired a slave child.
Yes, now I have that under the heading of strange but true. There is a woman named Lyndon Allen Bryant who's written a book called I Cannot Tell a Lie, The Story of George Washington's African American Descendants. And she is the descendant of a slave named West Ford. And West Ford was the son of a young girl named Venus, who was the slave of George Washington's brother, John Augustine of Westmoreland County. And there's an oral tradition in this family that when Venus was confronted by her mistress, Hannah Washington, with her pregnancy, she said, "Mistress, the old general is the father." Now, this is an oral tradition that's been passed down for hundreds of years and which first saw print in the 1940s. Now, in an earlier time, we would have dismissed this out of hand and said, well, yeah, it's an oral history, big deal. But in light of the case of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, you really have to pursue these things a lot more, because there was an oral tradition in the Hemings family that said Thomas Jefferson is the father of Sally Hemings' children. Subsequent DNA evidence demonstrated that there was Jefferson DNA in Heming descendants. And there was additional evidence in terms of who was in proximity to Sally Hemings at the time of her pregnancies, who could have been the father. And although the DNA would not say conclusively that only Thomas Jefferson would be the father, because any Jefferson male could have been, when you combine that with the other evidence, who was physically in proximity, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, the folks who run Monticello, said, "We believe that Thomas Jefferson was the father of one or all of Sally Hemings's children." So, where does that leave us with Washington? The DNA doesn't prove that George Washington was the father of Wes Ford. But the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the folks who run Mount Vernon, say, well, yeah, we think Wes Ford probably was sired by a Washington, just not George Washington. And so you have four possible suspects. You've got George Washington, you've got his brother, John Augustine, you have his nephew, Bushrod Washington, who inherited Mount Vernon from George and who later became a Supreme Court justice. And then you have the younger nephew, Corbin Washington. So the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon has said, if DNA science progresses, we pledge our full cooperation. But at this state of the science, we can only narrow it down to those four Washingtons who could have been the father of Wes Ford.
You know, I was thinking about that a little bit myself, and I was wondering, you know, sometimes you hear about cruel treatment of slaves, and you wonder if maybe with her pregnancy, the name of George Washington would be enough to protect her a little bit, the slave Venus. And so you wonder if maybe, yes, a Washington did sire, maybe it was John Augustine, but the wrath of the mistress for the husband siring a slave child, why not just say it was the old general?
Well, I mean, that's certainly something you have to look at. You just cannot say it was George Washington. On the other hand, you do have to pursue the evidence. You just can't protect his reputation because he is George Washington. Now, my own feeling is that it was Bushrod Washington, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at a portrait of Wes Ford, and then you look at a portrait of Bushrod Washington, I mean, it is clear to me in any event that he is probably your prime suspect. But that's just sheer speculation on my part.
Well, that's the downside. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back and take a peek and find out.
We have narrowed it down to at least four.
Well, all right, so we have four. Well, you know, one of the interesting people of this area is a gentleman by the name of John Mosby.
Yes.
And so Mosby being such an important guy in this area, what have you found out about him?
Well, the Civil War was certainly the most gruesome war we ever fought in. I don't think people should ever lose sight of the fact that 600,000 men died. As a percentage of population, that would equate to 5 million Americans today. Imagine a war on our soil where 5 million Americans died. That's a lot. But there were romantic episodes in that war, and that's what people remember. You remember Jeb Stuart with a plume in his hand, and you remember John Singleton Mosby, the gray ghost of the Confederacy. And he was like a Robin Hood type figure because he was raiding Union paymasters and robbing horses and shooting down pickets. He rode into Washington City, had drinks in disguise with Union officers, and sent President Lincoln a message saying, "The next time I come, I plan to visit you." And he was very generous to the Southerners who were left behind Union lines, who also supported his guerrilla band. So he was a Robin Hood type figure. And one of the things that also helped make him a Robin Hood type figure was the nature of one of his principal adversaries, a very pompous Englishman named Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham. And you say, what, an Englishman commanding U.S. troops? Well, yes, he was the commanding officer of the 1st New Jersey Cavalry. But it wasn't that unusual during the Civil War to have foreign officers fighting for both the Union and Confederacy. And as a matter of fact, Mosby had a former British officer, a captain in Her Britannic Majesty's 44th Regiment, a fellow named Bradford Smith Hoskins, fighting for him. And Hoskins was wounded in a skirmish in Greenwich Village, in the village of Greenwich, in Prince William County. And as he lay dying of his wounds, he stayed in the house of another Englishman named Charles Green at his home called The Lawn. And Green kept his house from being occupied by either the Union or the Confederacy by flying a huge British flag over his plantation throughout the war and declaring it to be neutral territory. And if you go to the village of Greenwich today, you can see a huge stone cross which marks the burying place of Bradford Smith Hoskins of Her Britannic Majesty's Army.
Well, how do you like that? And so, when we think about, so you have Mosby, you've got Washington, and there certainly is a lot of history there. Now, I saw in there Quakers, and so...
Yes, well, people tend to look back on history nostalgically and say, oh, for the good old days. But I would contend that these are the good old days, that Americans have always been contentious, they've always been fractious, and they've always been at one another's throats. And if you went back to the Revolution and the early Republic, you would find this. During the Revolutionary War, for example, there was a radical religious sect which caused great fear and hatred among its neighbors. We know that sect as the Quakers, because the pacifist Quakers would not fight for the Patriot cause during the Revolution. And so the Patriots said, well, they won't fight the British, they must be pro-British. After the war, they angered their neighbors by becoming abolitionists. And to put the frosting on the cake, they started opening schools for slave children, which slave owners thought was a sure recipe to cause servile insurrection.
Well, certainly a bit of a issue there to go ahead and deal with. Now,
and let me just, if we've got a few minutes, let me just
go ahead.
mention politicians. If you think politicians are bad today, basically they're throwing spitballs at each other. In the early Republic, politicians actually fought duels. And President Andrew Jackson fought over 100 duels before becoming President of the United States. In 1825, a Virginia Senator, John Randolph, was making a speech about the foreign policy of John Quincy Adams, not exactly a household word today, in which he intimated that the Secretary of State, now he didn't say it, but he hinted that the Secretary of State was a scoundrel, Secretary of State Henry Clay. And Clay challenged him to a duel. Now, I don't think very many of us can see John McCain and Hillary Clinton exchanging shots with each other at dawn.
I don't know, some people might. And I for one would pay for that, but that's just me. But you know, it's true, because when you think about Jackson, certainly his fiery temper is one for duels, and but Henry Clay as a duelist is certainly something you wouldn't expect to see whatsoever. Now, from what I understand, you are going to be running around Northern Virginia in the near future.
Yes, we'll be having a number of book signings, and if you keep an eye on our website, we'll be announcing exactly where those signings are. I'd certainly be happy to have you come down and chat with you about the hidden history of Northern Virginia and answer any of your questions, and more importantly, get any leads from you on other stories that we can write into Hidden History Part 2.
Well, that would always certainly be a good one to have as well. Now, I'm curious to know, before we go ahead and find ourselves having to sign off, is there any one particular hidden story that you would say is your hands down, this is just my favorite because you wouldn't believe it to see it?
Well, I think probably one of the most improbable stories is the UFO sightings in 1952, the so-called Washington Flap. In July 1952, for about 2 weeks, lights began to appear over the U.S. Capitol and in restricted space over the White House and the U.S. Capitol building. And for the first time, these strange, unidentified lights were seen on radar. And the headlines of the Washington Post and the local papers screamed, "Jets chase UFOs down Potomac," which is not something you generally see in our papers. And President Harry Truman actually picked up the phone, called the Air Force, and said, just what the heck is going on out there? Well, the Air Force convened a huge conference and came up with the explanation that these were heat inversions, and that's what was causing it. Well, in the intervening decades since then, we have not had similar heat inversions, nor have these mysterious lights appeared over the Capitol again. So many people, both then and now, really question the Air Force's explanation.
Did the pilots ever go ahead and give a statement, or were they told to be quiet?
Well, they never got to see them. I mean, when the lights were way ahead of the jets, and then they vanished. and then when the jets descrambled, they reappeared.
Very strange indeed. So it's one of those rare
And if
stories.
you want to go to your newspaper morgues, it's all there in the old newspapers.
And so is there a picture of the lights or no?
I believe there is one on YouTube. Now, whether that's a recreation or a dramatization, I'm not sure. It purports to be an actual footage from the 50s, but I would not swear to that.
Well, certainly we wouldn't want to go ahead and mislead people with wrong information. But A Hidden History of Northern Virginia is certainly a book that I would highly recommend everyone to go ahead and take a look at, because, you know, it's amazing to think about the different stories that happen in our backyards. You never know. Maybe you're living in a home that was once seen by John Mosby when he was doing his Confederate raids. Maybe you're living in an area that was greatly influenced by General Washington. Who knows? Maybe there's an old Quaker community right where you're sitting now. Any number of things could have happened. To learn more about the hidden history of Northern Virginia, please visit us at our website, www.timetravel21.com, or give us an email at timetravel21@yahoo.com. And this episode was brought to you through the Margarita and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. And we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. And hope you'll tune in once again so we can learn a little bit more about this state.